I want to talk about how the magic wand became so magic. I want to talk about its early days, its ascent to fame, and the people responsible for that ascent. It might seem odd to recount the history of a sex toy. Tons of new toys are created and launched every year, and in some ways, sex toys are intrinsically experienced in the present moment. When the average person uses a dildo or a butt plug, they're not thinking about all the people who came before them, so to speak. But the magic wand isn't just any sex toy. It's been around since 1968. That's over 50 years. In that time, it's had high points and low points, advocates and enemies, windfalls and challenges. It's shaped social movements and sparked international debates on pleasure and power. Its life story is rife with curveballs and calamities, almost like a person's life. But it's been more influential than most people will ever be. I'm Kate Sloan, and this is Making Magic, How the Magic Wand Became the World's Most Famous Vibrator.
I think that if we are gonna narrate the history of the magic wand and its rise to becoming a kind of icon of sexual liberation, particularly female sexual liberation, we have to start with Betty Dodson.
This is Lynn Camella, a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of Nevada. She's bringing up a name that you're going to hear a lot today, because in the 35 interviews I did for this series, no individual person came up more frequently than Betty Dodson.
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 Betty Dodson is this artist who, grew up in Kansas.
This, once again, is Hallie Lieberman, sex toy historian and author of Buzz, A Stimulating History of the Sex Toy. Like anyone who knows a lot about the story of the magic wand, she knows a lot about Betty Dodson.
She grew up very, this is the 50s and 40s, and she grew up very kind of normal, sexually repressed upbringing, learning very little about sex, masturbated as a teenager, as basically everyone does, and felt incredibly guilty, thought she was doing something completely dirty. She moves to New York when she's 29. She quickly gets married to some guy because of the norms of this time. This was the 1960s. She realizes marital sex is awful, just incredibly boring. She's not having orgasms. After sex, she rolls to the side and masturbates and gives herself an orgasm. So anyway, she's this person who, was muddling her way through these gender norms and realized for her that masturbation was such a powerful thing, and that, she did not have to rely on a man for her sexual pleasure. She was active in the feminist movement. She realized no one in the feminist movement was really talking about sexual pleasure. So she created these consciousness raising groups where all they did was talk about orgasms. And then she took them one step further and created these workshops where women, sat around in a circle. She led them in breathing exercise. She had them examine their genitals. And then she also taught them how to pleasure themselves and taught them to use vibrators. And her favorite one became the Hitachi magic wand.
Betty called these Bodysex workshops. Originally, they were called physical and sexual consciousness raising groups, but Bodysex is catchier.
She transformed her apartment in New York City into a Bodysex studio and was essentially teaching women how to masturbate.
She did these workshops, which took all weekend long, in the nude, in her Manhattan apartment, and it was sort of frightening for many to step in the door and say, "Great, take your clothes off, come on into the front room."
Here's Dr. Carol Queen, who you might remember from episode 1 as the staff sexologist at Good Vibes and the curator of the Antique Vibrator Museum.
It was sort of a great equalizer. It was a way to transition from one state of being into a whole different one.
In her body sex workshops, she had people strip down, take off all their clothes, and she would, masturbate to orgasm using a vibrator, and that vibrator was oftentimes the magic wand. And she would pass out the magic wand to the women who were participating in her workshops, and they too would masturbate, often to orgasm, sometimes for the very first time.
It was ritualistic in that way, but also really, really borrowed from or expanded on the second wave feminist notion of consciousness raising, the idea that you would get together in a group and start talking about your experience, and pretty soon, as the phrase went, you saw that the personal was political.
Betty died in 2020 at the age of 91, and I so wish I would have been able to interview her about this stuff while she was still around. The closest I've been able to get is interviewing a couple of people who actually attended a body sex workshop run by Betty herself, like Dr. Queen. It's not the same as actually attending a body sex workshop led by Betty myself, of course, something I really wish I'd been able to do, but it certainly paints a picture.
Betty was, in the 1960s, well known in New York as a fine artist who did sexually explicit paintings of people having sex. And one of her most famous explicit paintings was of her using a big old vibrator. She was sort of in the lotus position. Some people can manage to use a vibrator in the lotus position. I don't know. I always prefer lying down, but everyone's mileage may vary. And so this awesome painting started to make the rounds. I'm pretty sure she used it on the cover of her chapbook when she switched from full-time art making to women's sexuality education that became the body sex workshops, and that made her one of the most notorious second wave feminists who really focused on sexuality. There were plenty of second wave feminists for whom sexuality was kind of a problem, kind of a source of angst for many women, which of course it was, and of course it can be the source of angst for people of all genders, even here and now. But one of the things that Betty wanted to do was support the idea that each of us was responsible for our own orgasms. It wasn't our partners, whether or not they were good or clueless or somewhere in the middle. It was us and our understanding of our bodies and our understanding about how arousal and the path to orgasm worked for each one of us. And that was sort of the heart of her body sex workshops. One of the things she did during body sex workshops was have a vulva show and tell. And I guarantee you that none of the people who had learned how to do show and tell at any level of school had ever seen or conceived of a show and tell like that. And Betty, as a fine artist, would point out features of each body sex participant's vulva and give them give them names from art history. Oh, that's very Gothic. Look at the shape of that. Oh, such clean lines. This is much more modernist. She was really a hoot that way, and it was entirely disarming.
The other body sex attendee I interviewed was my friend Kasia Sobolewski, a somatic sex educator whose career beginnings were heavily influenced by Betty's work.
I was 21, and it was dawning on me that maybe I was potentially interested in pursuing sexuality as a career. And I was like, well, I should do some research. And there was Betty Dodson's Body Sex documentary available for purchase on her website. And I watched it. It was pretty life-changing, actually. Well, I mean, not pretty. It was life-changing. I mean, the masturbating in a circle thing was like almost beyond comprehension for me at that point. I was so bamboozled and in awe of the women gathering naked together so casually that's what started Body Pride. That was the beginning of Body Pride.
Body Pride is a workshop Kasia created that I've attended several times over the years. Like Bodysex, it always started with all the attendees getting naked, but masturbation wasn't on the agenda, and there was more of a focus on body image and how participants felt about their nude bodies overall, not just the sexual bits.
We would have snacks, we would sit in a circle, I would invite people to undress all at once, and then we would sit and talk about sexuality, relationships, masturbation, body image for like a few hours. And then we had a naked dancing photo shoot at the end where everyone got to just be naked and have fun in front of the camera. It was so sweet and special and lovely and amazing to see how many people came to them, but also how many people just suddenly became comfortable being nude just like minutes after they undressed and were so like awkward in their nudity and then relaxed into it. I think that was my favorite part, the realization that no one wanted to put their clothes back on at the end. I think that in itself is where the transformation is. The cool part about it, which I didn't know at the time, but I probably had some kind of awareness of, was that it's somatic sex education. I was doing a somatic process with people where it's like, okay, you have body image issues or you want to get over some stuff or you have some fear of nudity. Well, let's get naked in a room together and just be there together. Like the somatic element of actually going through that was huge. It had a huge impact.
Somatic sex education ended up being one of Kasha's callings, and she's now a certified somatic sex educator, meaning that she works with clients in a hands-on way to help them with things like sexual communication and boundary setting, feeling worthy of pleasure, and staying present in their body during sex, all themes that Betty emphasized in her work as well.
The concept of bringing women together and supporting them and learning how to masturbate and self-pleasure is incredible. When you actually do hands-on things with people or get them to touch themselves or look at their vulvas or experience orgasm, being witnessed by another person, there's so many elements of that that fit into somatic sex education, and it's these somatic practices that the most impact and transformation happens in. So I don't know if Betty knew it at the time, and she sadly may never, but that somatic piece was so embedded into her practice that the experience itself was so powerful and potent for people.
Kasha was eventually able to save up enough money to travel from Toronto to New York and attend a Bodysex workshop in person, facilitated by Betty and her business partner, Carlin Ross. Now, as we've been talking about, some of Betty's most famous contributions to the world were teaching these workshops and handing out magic wands to the people who attended them. But she also offered one-on-one sessions for individuals who wanted to improve their relationship to masturbation, learn how to use a vibrator, or learn how to reach an orgasm altogether. Do you remember when you got your first magic wand?
Well, I first used it actually before I had one. And that was actually with Betty Dodson.
This is Tristan Taormino, a sex educator, writer, former director of feminist porn, and a personal hero of mine. You might know her from her books like Opening Up, A Guide to Creating and Sustaining Open Relationships, or from her porn films like Tristan Taormino's Expert Guide to Pegging. For a while, she was also the editor of the legendary lesbian sex magazine, On Our Backs.
I was writing an article for On Our Backs, and I went to a one-on-one session with Betty Dodson where she's basically like a masturbation coach. You're like on the floor in her living room, and she had the Betty barbell, which was this amazing metal toy, and she had the Hitachi, and she had lube and all those things. And so the very first time I used it, I was masturbating for Betty Dodson. And she handed it to me and I put it on my clit and I nearly jumped off the floor. My first reaction was, this is not a pocket rocket. I don't know if anyone knows what the pocket rocket is, but a pocket rocket is this tiny little thing. It's the size of kind of a tampon applicator, I guess. And it takes one battery and it's, pretty chill. So it could give me an orgasm. So that's what I was using. And so jumping kind of from the pocket rocket to the magic wand, it was too much. And so she actually got a piece of cloth and she said, I'm going to diffuse the vibration for you. You're going to put the cloth between your vulva and the head of the vibrator. And then I felt like, okay, this is more manageable.
This was one of Betty's many talents, teaching others how this intimidating behemoth of a vibrator could actually be approachable, fun, pleasurable, and even feminist.
I mean, she was the first person to introduce the wand to like a ton of people who would come to these workshops, and she'd be like, hey, have you ever tried this?
It's clear that Betty's approach taught people a lot in her group workshops and one-on-one sessions. But her work has had a much wider reach than that, sometimes even showing up on the syllabus for university-level classes on sexuality, like those taught by Dr. Lori Mintz, the sex therapist and psychology professor who we met last episode. There's a particular video from Betty's website that Dr. Mintz shows to her students every year.
So, I teach about the orgasm gap. I teach about women's sexual pleasure. I teach about vibrators. And that video that I show, I will say, I've been showing it for about 12 years, and it's always both a shock to the students and a turning point in the class. The one I use is called, I think it's called Becoming Orgasmic Carol. She interviews this young woman who's a med student who's never had an orgasm, and she films her and Carol having these private lessons using the wand. And I am telling you, every time I show that movie, I get such incredible reactions. And I can tell you that I have students write to me after I show that video and give my accompanying lecture. I can't tell you how many students write me after that lecture a week or two. Well, guess what? I had my first orgasm. I think it's normalizing the way that they have been masturbating, and many times feeling guilty about it or weird. I think it's normalizing the use of vibrators. I think it's like a beautiful video about embracing and empowering someone's sexuality. And at the end of the video, Betty says to Carol, who do you love? And Carol says, I love me. And there's even a part where they're looking at her vulva in the mirror, and Betty says, do you see how beautiful your vulva is? It's just like the whole video is so educational and empowering.
I have no idea what our culture's understanding of female masturbation would be now, or even just masturbation in general, if Betty hadn't done all the things she did. She sought and gained so much sexual wisdom in her life, and she shared it so openly with everyone around her that she quite literally and tangibly changed the world.
I mean, everybody looked to her as an expert, of course, but when you got into a Bodysex workshop, the whole circle was the source of the expertise. There are ways to pull information from the inside out rather than waiting for experts to bestow that information on us. And this is what Betty's project was. And I'm surprised that the roof was still on the apartment building that Betty lived in Manhattan after all of that, all the many, many, many years of many weekends of many women, and probably toward the end there, non-binary identified people getting together and saying, okay, we're going to use these vibrators until we come, and then some.
Betty influenced more people than she'll ever know, not only through how she spread the good word about the magic wand, but through her advocacy for self-empowerment and pleasure. She taught countless people to trust themselves and trust their bodies, to insist on equality in and out of the bedroom, and to have mind-blowing orgasms. She was a true icon, much like the magic wand itself. Although I and many of the experts I spoke to are in agreement that the magic wand wouldn't be nearly as iconic if Betty hadn't come along to make it so. In the next episode of Making Magic, we'll talk about some other sexual revolutionaries who were influenced by Betty's work, as well as how the magic wand made its way into the first feminist sex toy stores, and from there, into the hands of eager pleasure seekers across the nation. Until then, keep on making magic. Making Magic is hosted and co-produced by me, Kate Sloan, edited and co-produced by Jamie Pittenger, and made possible by the generous support of Vibratex, with art by Addison Finch. Special thanks to my guests for this episode, Dr. Lynn Camella, Dr. Carol Queen, Dr. Lori Mintz, Hallie Lieberman, Kasia Sobolewski, and Tristan Termino. You can find links to their work in the show notes.